Thank you for the great introduction. I'd just like to inform you that I like to introduce myself as Engineer John Cato. You know, all the doctors, they call themselves Doctor so-and-so. The lawyers, they say I'm Advocate so-and-so. Why don't us engineers call ourselves Engineer so-and-so? So I'd like to introduce myself as Engineer John Cato, just so that we start taking pride in our registration and who we are and what we've achieved. So today I'd just like to go through what we're going to be talking about in terms of registration with ECSA, our renewal of registration and continuing professional development. But why are we engineers? What are engineers? We are problem solvers, and this is why we go through this rigorous process of becoming registered. Problem solving reminds me of a joke that I heard the other day in terms of in the olden 18th century where there was an advocate, a doctor and an engineer. They were due for execution. So the doctor says, okay, what is the execution? So they said, by guillotine. So the executioner says, listen, how do you want to do it? Do you want a head covered? So he says, no, I want to see what happens. So he says, do you want to head up, see the guillotine coming? He says, absolutely, I want to see what happens. So he lies him down, everything. Next minute, the executioner pulls the thing, guillotine comes, stops just above his head. In the 18th century, if you weren't killed by execution, you were excused. Pardon, off he walks. So the lawyer says, right, this is the way to do it. He did exactly the same, head up, head cover off, lies down. Again, the thing stops just before cuts his head off. Pardon, off he walks. The engineer says, hey, this is going to work for me. So he lies down, exactly the same, hood off, head up. And as the executioner is just about to pull the thread, the engineer says, hey, I know where your problem lies. So this is what us engineers are all about. We're there to solve problems. So as an introduction, we're here to solve problems. And that's what ECSA is there, is to assess your problem-solving skills. So I'd just like to run through, in terms of ECSA, how we go about our registration. There's a pipeline of development in terms of we attend an accredited program, preferably, because that eases your process, which then meets the educational requirements for an engineer. So at the end of your university, you become qualified, you get your graduation certificate, and everything's hunky-dory. Then you get registered as a candidate, preferably. It's not a prerequisite. But then we start our training in life. We work under a supervisor, we work under a registered engineer. They train us to what we are to become. At the end of the training, we then meet our professional competencies. We are then registrable, and then we come to ECSA and we say, here's everything, please register me. You then gain your professional registration, then life begins. We start our lifelong practice as independent practice is what we call it. You can now practice engineering independently. With that, fortunately, comes your professional conduct that you have to abide by, and also meeting our continuous professional development, as we're going to talk about a little bit later. And that, just in principle, is on a 5-yearly cycle where you need to keep your points up. So at ECSA, we have professional registration, we have candidate registration, and then we have specified categories. You'll see here we've got the engineer, the technologist, the certificated engineer, and the engineering technician. You'll see the different basic qualifications required, a BSc, a BEng, BTech. The certificated engineer is a strange animal. You can get anywhere, get your GCC and 1 year of legal appointment, and then you can become a certificated engineer. And over and above that, the last one is the national diploma for the technician. We then have the similar categories for registration as a candidate. So obviously that's your training phase. You register as a candidate to train up to be an engineer. And then we have specified categories. We've got the lift inspectors, and you can read them up there. So those are the categories in which you can register at ECSA, and we are looking to expand this at the moment to other areas that may be applicable in the industry. So for candidate registration, what do we look at? We basically look at your qualification to determine whether you meet our stage 1 requirements. So there's a number of options that we look at. We look at the accredited route or accredited qualification. That's the qualifications that ECSA go to the university and accredit that particular program that you studied, whether it's civil engineering, mechatronics, agricultural engineering, and so forth. And that is an accredited degree. So you come to ECSA with that, we're absolutely happy because we've accredited at university, we know it meets the relevant standards. Then we look at recognized qualifications. These are qualifications that are part of the Accord countries, the Washington Accord, the Sydney Accord, the Dublin Accord, where if you have a qualification from one of those countries that are signed up to those accords, we will recognize that qualification here at ECSA. Over and above that, there are certain other qualifications that over the years have met the relevant standards, so we will recognize those, but that's not a formal recognition, it's just based on experience. Then we look at the qualification evaluation equivalency. So this is a requirement from ECSA where you submit a number of qualifications that may not be accredited. One may be accredited, may not be accredited, may come from a different country, or whatever the case may be. And then we do a qualification evaluation on that particular application to determine the equivalency of that application, to see that it meets ECSA's standard for that particular category that you're applying for. So obviously we still have this different categories in terms of that qualification. Over and above that, we look at this one as the individual assessment. This is, you have a qualification, but you've got years of experience. So then they look at that in terms of how many years of experience have you had at a senior level and so forth. And they again do an evaluation on that to determine your equivalency at what level you can register. Then we look at the professional registration. So that's the stage 1. The second stage is your professional registration, which then looks at your competencies, your developed competencies during your training phase. Again, in the worldwide, they look at your education requirements. That's where we look at the education standard, and that's our candidate, where you are able to register as a candidate. Over and above that, they look at a minimum, this is worldwide, 3 years of experience to that qualify you to register as a professional in terms of the qualifications. So ECSA has similarly followed suit. So we look at, for professional category, we look at the educational outcome, which I've described before, and then we look for the individual to demonstrate competency. And these are all done by peer assessments. And the method in terms of the competency requirements, we look at this 2-stage process where we look at the experience appraisal and the professional review. I'm highlighting the engineers because that's the most complicated process that we have at ECSA. And the other ones are fairly similar, slight differences, but generally will follow a similar process. So the experience appraisals is all your training that you've done and that you've recorded. The guys do a desktop review of that and say, great, what you've written down looks like you qualify in terms of the competency requirements that we are looking for. They then move it on to the professional review. This is where the guys interview you. And this is easy for the guys to define whether you've actually written that report or not. It's quite easy for them to ask 1 or 2 questions and they'll be able to determine whether you're actually competent as your report has said. We do this extended experience appraisal where we don't have resources to carry out the extended appraisal and the professional review. It's a more intense desktop study of your application. And even at this stage, they sometimes do require an interview of the individual to determine certain aspects that they are wanting to query. And obviously, we've gone onto the new registration system, which assesses each category. Doesn't matter what discipline, whether you're an agricultural engineer, civil engineer, or chemical engineer, we assess you the same. You might say, but how can you? We're not looking at technical abilities, we're looking at professional competency requirements. So can you design? Doesn't matter what you design, can you design? Can you analyze? Civil engineer designs different things to the chemical engineer. So that's the difference. We look at what you do as opposed to how you do it as opposed to what you actually do. These are the competency requirements that we look at. These are your core competency requirements as grouped in as the core, which is your design, synthesis, and your contextual knowledge, using the formulas that you learned at university. So these are your complex engineering problems. Surrounded that are your softer sort of engineering activities, and we've grouped them. There's 5 different groups, but communication and management of those activities. We then look at the regulatory requirements and the impacts. What is your project impact in terms of the society, the environment, and so forth? And then we look at the ethics, the judgment, and being responsible. This is where we define our degree of responsibility. And I'll come to the degree of responsibility at a later stage. But that is very important in terms of the assessment. And then we also look at what they call lifelong learning in terms of your application is your initial professional development. What it says is, over and above your university degree, we want to see that you've taken initiative and taken a course here and a course there before you actually come and apply for professional registration. This looks at the whole complex engineering activity. So from your core engineering work to all the surrounding things, that's what we define as an activity within the environment. I'm referring here complex because that's the engineer's level. There's different levels for the different categories. For the technologist, we define this complex as broadly defined, and for the technician, we talk about well-defined activities. So that's pretty much it in terms of what we look at. And I thought what the easiest way is to take an application form and show you what we require and where it needs to be filled in. I think that a lot of confusion comes in. How do we fill out these forms? What are you guys looking for? So I decided to look at the application form. It's fairly straightforward. That bit of the form, personal information, guys. Then what we look at is your qualifications. 1 qualification, 2 qualifications, that's where you put it in. And don't forget to get a commissioner of oath to sign the front of the form. The next page, obviously, we look at the previous registration. Are you registered as a candidate, or were you registered as a technician or technologist and now you want to become an engineer? So we want to know, just so that we can see the previous information there. Your VA membership, so you guys belong to SAIAE, so that information goes in there, and that assists in terms of your fees and that in terms of annual fees. This one is to tell us who are your referees. We want to know who the referees are. So it's just names and details there. And then finally, you need to sign and make a declaration. According to the Act, there's certain requirements that you need to declare, and we'll get a little bit into that a little bit later. So this is what I call the T's and C's, the small print, which not many people read, but there's a lot of information in there that actually helps you complete the application. So this tells you what kind of documents are required. We won't look at the application if you don't have any of these documents. If one document is missing, the guys will not process your application. All right. And then the important part here is the referees' reports. Because what happens is the guys send an invitation to the referee to say, please do a referee report for me, and it gets sent in 3 months, 4 months, 5 months down the line, and the individual goes, why is my application taking so long? We haven't got the referee's report. So that's important. And then obviously your qualification details. Is it a Washington Accord? The details of your qualification. So that explains what you need to fill out in that particular form. Going further, those are your VA requirements. Is it a recognized VA within ECSA? Because we recognize certain VAs. So that tells you how you must do it. Obviously there's a section there in terms of the fees, where you must pay and so forth. And then the important here, these are the referee's requirements. If you look at the fine print here, which you most probably can't see, is a mentor, it's an immediate supervisor, a colleague, and the last one is possibly even a client that you've worked for. If you're doing business on your own and you don't have a mentor, a client will be able to, as a last resort, be able to verify your work that you do. This is the declaration in terms of our Act, EPA Section 19.3, Section A, that defines all the requirements in terms of you shouldn't be declared insolvent and you'll be healthy and all those kind of things. You can go and read it up. But that's what you're declaring, that you are eligible for registration. All right. Then we come to the more interesting part of the application is the training and experience report, what we call the TER. I don't know in your industry, but at ECSA, acronyms are abounding there, and to understand all the different acronyms is quite amazing. So this is fairly straightforward. You've got to sign at the bottom. You need to get your supervisor to sign at the top. You need to define your degree of responsibility for this particular training period. Okay? So remember that the training period is where you have a certain level of responsibility, or you've changed employ, or whatever the case may be. So you need to fill out one of these forms for each period of training. Okay? And this is where you define your degree of responsibility. And I'll get to the definitions of what those are. It's either A, B, C, D, or E. There's 5 levels of degrees of responsibility. So then in this big block here is where you fill out the details. Basically what we want is the guys to write in first person. I want you to describe what you have done. Okay? We don't want to know how you did it yet. We want to know what you did. So I designed a bridge, I designed a reticulation system, whatever the case may be. That's what you describe here in this part of the form. What you did, okay? And again, degree of responsibility. Can't emphasize that more. And again, don't generalize. Say you work for a particular company. This company did A, B, and C. We're not interested in what this company did. We're interested in what you did for that company. So it's a slight difference there. The TR must cover experience and details of the latest 3 to 5 years. There's a reason why I put that in, because the mature candidates can use this particular form, which is a TEO, the Training Experience Outline. So this is for the mature candidates which have more experience, and they don't necessarily have an immediate supervisor from 15 years ago. So this is basically just to bullet out what, again, the relevant signatures and the degree of responsibility. These guys have greater than 5 years experience. So beyond the 5 years, you start bulleting your information, what you did. So 10 years ago, from this period to this period, I did A, B, and C. And this is a self-declaration. You may not be able to get a supervisor's signature, but you can get an affidavit to say this is true and factual. And that's basically the outline report, which obviously then leads you up to the 5 years. After the 5 years is now your current TER report, and that's what you need to complete there. Now this is your training experience. This is just a summary of your TERs and your TEOs. So basically this summary needs to define the periods that you've worked. How many periods? They don't want every single period that you worked. On average about 9 to 10 periods is generally what is understandable in terms of moving through the level of responsibility. And even if you missed a period for whatever reason, they just need to know that from your qualification date to your submission date, all the numbers add up. So that's basically what they look for in terms of the weeks. And obviously you need to sign, we have to get you to sign every page. We're becoming like lawyers, initial every page. So this is the training experience. This is the details of how you must complete it. Again, the information required in the report. So here, you'll see it's bold here, organogram, showing your position in that particular phase of work. So I was either direct report to the supervisor or was 2 levels down, or whatever the case. It tells you specifically, show 2 levels above and below your particular position. All right, so that's what's required in the reports. And then again, what I referred to, this details out what the mature applicants, those that have more experience, what they have to do in those particular reports. And now this is where people get confused. 2,000 words. Is it 2,000 words per period of training experience? No, it's for all your training experience. So all 9 reports must be a maximum of 2,000 words. The more you write, the longer it's going to take for the assessors to actually go through the information. All right, so that's quite simply put. This is the engineering report. Again, you need to sign. There's a word count for the engineering report that they like to see where you sit. And the engineering report has a maximum of 6,000 words. So considering the amount of words, it's probably about 12 to 13 pages, depending on what kind of font you used. Again, at the bottom here, you can't see it too well. It says sell yourself. So the new registration system is more about you telling the assessors that you are competent to be an engineer. You've got to tell them, I've achieved that outcome, I've achieved that outcome. How did you do it? On this project, I did A, B, and C. And that's what goes in the body of the report here. And these are just sort of things that the assessors have picked up in the past that have sort of indicated to them, listen, these guys need to go back. They haven't used the application of their technical knowledge, the professional appreciation, narrow field. I've only worked over here and done one element of work. So it needs to be a bit broader. Your poor organization of thoughts, I worked here and then I worked there. Be sequential and so forth. Poor communication, that's I think, and poor writing skills. And obviously some people try and they don't have enough experience. So make sure you've got enough experience and have the relevant. So these are the details in terms of the engineering report. Cross-reference to the TER. So how it works is the TER says what you did. I designed a bridge. Okay, in period 1. So in your engineering report, you need to cross-reference period 1. So you say, designing the bridge, I did this, I analyzed this, and I synthesized this. So I used my contextual knowledge by using these formulas when I designed that bridge as indicated in TER 1. So it's a cross-reference to make sure that where you're defining your TER, you're at the right level of responsibility as well. And as again I said, there's 6,000 words maximum. Over and above that, you can submit an appendix which doesn't form part of the 6,000 words for calculations if you want to submit them. But again, it's not about can you make a calculation. It's about your mind thinking how to do the calculation. So the calculation in some instances is required, some instances is not required. These are the degrees of responsibility that I was talking to earlier. So this is basically as you come out of university, you're being exposed. You induct, you observe what happens around you. As you start going, you go from assisting, you under close supervision, your supervisor says, please do this, please do that. Right, under limited supervision, please go and do this and report back. With approval of work output, performs with approval, and then performing works without supervision. Okay, so that's obviously the level that we're trying to achieve, is the performing level. So that's where the minimum of 1 year at this particular level performing, so that you're taking responsibility for your work, you've done all the work yourself, made the decisions and so forth. And that is obviously you look here with a registered person who's overseeing the whole work. This part of the application form is the IPD. All we want is a list of the courses, induction courses, in-house training, conferences that you've attended to during your training period. Okay, so it doesn't have to be accredited by ECSA, so you don't have to go through accreditation of the course or anything like that. It's just any course that you have done over your training period, but it obviously has to be contextual in terms of your discipline and so forth. All right, so that's just a schedule of your IPD. Now this is your referee's report. This is what you send to the referee, saying, please, I'm making an application, please will you be my referee? I need you to make an assessment of me. So you fill in your details so that the referee knows who he's talking about. And then the referee has to fill in his section of the report. So basically he needs to know who you are. And this section here is the association. What's the relationship between the referee and the applicant? Is it a mentor? Is it a supervisor? Or what kind of relationship are we talking about there? We want to know, do you have knowledge of what this guy can do, or are you just sort of an outsider that's been asked to do this particular work? Then he goes through his particular assessment of that individual. These are the 11 outcomes that we're referring to in that big complex engineering activity diagram I showed you. This is what he assesses you against. Okay, so it's Group A, engineering problem solving. Define, investigate, and analyze complex problems. He rates you and he gives you a reason. And then he goes through all 11 outcomes and he decides some may be positive, some may be negative. Over and above that, he then makes an overall assessment. He says, well, you may be short here, but as an overall, I believe you are registrable or you're not registrable. And then obviously, we need to know who this particular individual is, and his details go in at that particular location. So this gives him, the referee, or her, sorry, what they need to do. So here again you'll see who should the referee be: the mentor, the supervisor, a colleague at a higher level or the same level, a colleague directly involved with the applicant's work employer, and again lastly possibly the client. But these mentors, these referees need to understand the competency standards. All right, this is what he's assessing against. So those are the standards that ECSA has developed to define your competency at that particular level, engineer, technologist, and so forth. So he needs to have a good understanding, and there's documents on our website that he can download and read at his leisure to make sure that he understands what he's assessing. All right. And then obviously the assessment scale, which is sort of acronyms again, but it's just saying, yes, he demonstrates competency consistently, not consistently, all the time, and so forth. And unfortunately, we've put an X there, I'm unable to comment, which is never a good thing to have a referee put down, because obviously then he doesn't either have direct relationship with you to be able to make that input on that. So that's basically the application, and then you go through that process of the experience appraisal. So you fill out those application forms, send them in, they go through experience appraisal, professional review, and hopefully, hey presto, you get registered. Obviously, after that, there's the renewal of registration. So what is the renewal of registration? In terms of the Engineering Act, you'll read there, we need to look after the public health and safety, and it's a duty that we need to renew registration as prescribed by the council. It doesn't, in the Act, it doesn't tell us how, but what has happened, the council has determined that it's a 5-year cycle that you need to renew your registration with, and with that 5-year cycle, the council linked continuing professional development. Why did they do that? Because they want to create a culture of continuing professional development. This is where you increase your knowledge as you grow in your career. So this is one way that they are trying to monitor the growth of the individual. So that's why we do continuing professional development. as I said before, it's linked to the renewal, and that is a legal requirement. Okay. It's also part of the international best practice. We belong to the Washington Accord, and all the countries that belong to those accords have a CPD requirement within their qualification, within their registration. So those are the Washington Accords. And obviously, if you do CPD, you become globally competitive, because now you continue your professional development. And with the Accords, you now have what they call mobility. And I benefited from the mobility of Ireland being part of the Washington Accord, South Africa being part of the Washington Accord. When I went to Ireland, I got registered by making application. I didn't have to go through the same process as I went through here in South Africa. So it has those kind of benefits in terms of the mobility as well. So obviously the CPD is a systematic maintenance, improvement and broadening of knowledge and skills, and the development of personal quality necessary for the execution of professional and technical duties throughout a person's engineering life. So that's why we do CPD. Okay? Who needs to do CPD? Well, obviously, if you're registered, as we said, it's a legal requirement because it's linked to renewal. So all registered professionals need to do it. We also have, as I said before, we have a specified category. So those people registered in that category also need to abide by continuing professional development. However, the candidate does not need to comply with CPD, as CPD is only post-registration and the candidate is before registration. So the candidate will need to have that RPD, as I explained before, for his registration. It counts towards his actual registration. So the CPD requirements, and I think this is where the crux of the matter is in terms of what do we have to do? You have to get 5 points per annum over a 5-year cycle. So you need to accumulate 25 points over a 5-year cycle. How can we do that? People say, hey, five points a year is difficult. Not really. You have to do a minimum of 3 in 2 of the categories. And I'll go through the categories a little bit later. And you can carry over from 1 year to the next year. But you cannot carry over from one cycle to the next cycle. So within your 5-year period, whatever you earned over and above the 25 cannot be carried over to the next 5-year cycle. But within that 5-year cycle, you do 10 points here, 5 can carry over, and so forth, and so forth. You can record them manually. There's a form that you can download, that ECPD1 form, again, another acronym. And you can fill it in, send it in, and the administration will upload that information. Or if you're brave enough, you can capture it electronically on our website, which is not the most efficient website. I've done it over the last 20 years to capture your CPD, but we are looking to improve that. But there is an electronic version that you are able to capture it. And you will get a notice 5 months prior to your registration elapsing to say, listen, in 5 months' time, your registration will lapse. Please make sure your CPD is up to date. Complete the renewal application form. There is an application form to renew your registration. There is no fees associated with it, but there is an application form. We use that to get updated details and things like that. So that's why we use just a form. All right. So here we look at Category 1. This is Category 1, which is your courses, conferences, workshops, lectures, seminars, colloquiums, and so forth. So these is where the service provider goes to ECSA or their voluntary association and gets that particular course accredited. Certain number of points get assigned to that, and it goes onto our website, and you then claim those points if you attend that particular workshop. So again, you can have an annual maximum of 4, and obviously in your 5-year cycle you need to achieve 5. But you can carry over, as I said earlier. So category 2 is work-based activities. Carrying out your day-to-day work, you get CPD points, all right? 1 credit for 300 hours, and you can accumulate 2 over the year, all right? So 600 hours working in the environment that you work in will get you 2 points. Now, if you're wanting to transfer skills, you want to do mentoring, you get 1 credit per year for mentoring of 50 hours, all right? So there's already 3 points there. Now, this is a very detailed and small slide which you can't see here, but I'll read some of it. The top one here is member of a recognized voluntary association. You get 1 point there, all right? And then these are sort of self-study, part of working groups, part of university examinations and so forth. There's a whole bunch of stuff here that you can get additional online courses, self-studies and stuff like that. So you can get, it's basically 1 CPD point for 10 notional hours of work done there. So if you look at a 5 point per year, you get 2 points for working where you are, doing what you do. Now if you're mentoring, you get another point. Now if you belong to a VA, you get another point. You're only short 1 point. It's not difficult to get your CPD points in a cycle. And that can be a conference or a 1-day course or whatever the case may be. So the CPD is not difficult to achieve. However, we do have an audit process that we are able to look at 10% of the CPD records just to make sure you say you self-studied or you attended this course, provide us with the certificates and so forth and so forth. That's why we say, listen, you need to keep your records for at least 5 years in that 5-year cycle so that from your year 1 and you get audited, we say, listen, that course that you attended, have you got that certificate? And you need to provide that certificate to obviously prove that you attended that course. And some of the records that you do happen to load or may be determined unacceptable, we do have a committee that will look at it and make a decision on that particular CPD application to say yes, qualifies for 1 point or whatever the case may be. If you're living in South Africa and you attend an international conference for whatever reason, it is not validated by ECSA. However, you can get forms to fill in that details out that particular conference, names, presenters, what was discussed, and that goes to the committee for a decision to say that's worth 1, 2 points or whatever the case may be. So there's a number of ways that you can accumulate the various points. So that in a nutshell is the registration, the renewal of registration, and the continuing professional development. So that is basically what I wanted to say today. But in terms of the training, obviously there is a requirement from either the employer to make sure that he trains you efficiently, to get the relevant experience in terms of those competencies. So yes, a commitment and undertaking is an ideal situation to train under, because that employer has really decided that they want these people registered, so they go through a formal training program with the candidates. And there are forms that you, as the employer, fill in terms of who the mentors are and who the employer is, so that we can identify those that come through a commitment and undertaking. We understand that they've actually gone through a formal training program. So that in a nutshell, and I must probably take questions afterwards, or we'll complete the presentations and then I'll take questions afterwards. All right, thank you.